They put the sign in my yard while I was still under the drugs. Not after. While. My heart stopped for 11 seconds on a table in San Antonio. By the time it started again, there was a realtor's sign standing in my grass. My house's photo already printed on it. They took my ranch office. They took my truck keys off the hook by the door. My own daughter said, "Dad, it's just easier this way." The anesthesia hadn't even cleared out of my blood yet. I picked up the phone anyway. I called a woman who'd been waiting 12 years for exactly this call. But before the phone call, there was the sign. And before the sign, there was the surgery. Let me take you back 9 days. My name is Russell Hargrove. I am 72 years old. I ran cattle on this land for 44 years. Before that, I sold it. Other people's cattle. Weighed and priced and hollered out over a microphone in a barn that smelled like dust and diesel. I did not raise my voice for the last 9 days of this story. I did not need to. A nurse woke me up asking about a sign. That was the first thing I heard, coming up out of the surgery. Not "how are you feeling?" Not "you did great." A woman in blue scrubs, holding a phone. "Mr. Hargrove, I'm sorry. There's a man on the line asking about a for sale sign in your yard. Do you know anything about that?" I didn't. I said so. My throat felt like sandpaper. She said the caller identified himself as my son-in-law, said it was fine, said it was already handled, said don't wake the old man for this. I told her to put him through. Chad's voice came on cheerful as church bells. "Russell! Hey buddy, don't worry about a thing, everything's under control. You just focus on getting better." I asked him what sign. He laughed. An actual laugh, like I'd made a joke. "The listing sign, Russ. For the ranch." We talked about this. We had not talked about this. I want you to understand something about me before this story goes any further. I spent 44 years reading cattle. You learn to watch an animal's eyes before it moves. By the time it moves, you're already too late to get out of the way. A steer that's about to bolt gives you a tell 3 seconds before it runs. Its ear flicks wrong. Its weight shifts back on its haunches. I've caught that tell 1,000 times. It saved me from getting trampled more than a few of them. I heard Chad's laugh on that phone. I heard the tell in it. The ear flick, the weight shift. A man trying to sound relaxed who is not relaxed at all. I said, "Chad, I did not authorize a sign in my yard." He said, "Well, Kimberly and I figured, with everything going on, it just makes sense to simplify. You're not going to want to run that whole operation after this, Russ. Nobody expects you to." I hung up. I did not slam the phone down. I did not raise my voice at a nurse who had nothing to do with any of it. I set the phone on the little rolling table next to the bed. I lay back. I looked at the ceiling tile for a long minute. I thought about a conversation I'd had with a lawyer 12 years ago, back when none of this had a name yet, back when it was just a bad feeling in my gut after a different hospital visit. Then I asked the nurse for my own phone, the one in the bag with my clothes. I called Corinne Pettibone. She picked up on the second ring. She always does. I've paid that woman a retainer for 12 years. In 12 years, she has never once let a call go to voicemail when it's me. "Russell," she said, "are you all right?" "I'm alive," I said. "There's a sign in my yard." There was a pause on her end. Not confusion, recognition. The kind of pause a person makes when a thing they've been waiting on finally arrives. "I'll make a call," she said. That's all she said. "I'll make a call. Sit with that for a second." That sentence is the whole shape of this story, if you already know how to read it. I didn't threaten anybody. I didn't hire an actor to stand in the yard. I didn't call the sheriff. An old man, 9 days off a table, tube still taped to the back of his hand, said 3 words to a lawyer. Something enormous and quite started moving underneath the ground Chad thought he was standing on. I should tell you how I got here. Not the surgery, the 44 years. I grew up on 80 leased acres, 8 miles outside a town called Corrigan Springs, hill country north of Kerrville, Texas. My father leased that ground from a man named Delacroix. Delacroix never once set foot on it, in the 20 years my father worked it. I was 9 years old the first time I watched a bank foreclose on a neighbouring ranch. I watched a family load a truck in the rain. The auctioneer's assistant nailed a notice to their fence post while they loaded. I decided right then, the way a 9-year-old decides things, that I would never be a man standing on ground somebody else could take away with a piece of paper. I bought my first 80 acres at 26, cash mostly, a note the bank barely wanted to write me. By the time I was 40, I'd bought out 3 neighbouring spreads, 1 parcel at a time, paid for in cattle sold, and cattle bred. Paid for in a livestock auction business I ran out of a barn on the edge of town for 30 years. By the time I sold that auction business at 66, the Hargrove Ranch sat at 1,100 acres. Every foot of it paid for. Every fence line walked by these two hands more times than I could count. My wife Opal kept the books the whole time. 30 years of ledgers in her handwriting. Columns straight as fence wire. Not a smudge on a page. She could tell you within $100 what the ranch was worth on any given Tuesday, just by looking at her own numbers. She never once asked me for anything that wasn't already ours to give. Opal died 6 years ago. Cancer, slow and then not slow at all. I'm not going to walk you through the hospital room. I'll tell you this much. The last clear week she had, she sat me down at our kitchen table. The same table Chad would later sit at, telling my daughter the sale was basically done. She said, "Russell, don't let the land go to whoever's loudest at the table. Let it go to whoever's still standing on it when the dust settles." I didn't fully understand what she meant that week. I understood it completely 9 years later, in a hospital bed, listening to my son-in-law explain that everything was under control. Kimberly is my daughter, my only child. She married Chad Ostrander 11 years ago, a good-looking, quick-talking man who ran a real estate brokerage down in San Antonio. All leased office space and rented suits. Nothing built with his hands that I ever saw. I liked him fine at the wedding. I want to be fair about that. He shook my hand hard and looked me in the eye. He told me he'd take care of my daughter. For a long time, in the small ways that show up day to day, he did. But a man's true shape only comes out under load. You can look at a support beam every day for years, and it'll hold up your roof just fine. Right up until the day the snow gets heavy enough to test it. Chad's beam had been holding fine for 11 years, because nothing had ever really pushed on it. Then something pushed on it. I found out later, though I didn't know it that morning in the hospital, that Chad's brokerage had lost its 2 biggest clients inside of 4 months. That he'd personally signed his name to a $161,000 lease on an office suite he could no longer fill with anybody's business. That the landlord who owned that building was 8 weeks from lawyering up. I found out he'd told his business partner, in a conversation Boyd Lasseter's nephew happened to overhear at a barbecue place in San Antonio, that Kimberly's dad has got more land than he'll ever use. Once it's listed, the commission alone gets me out of this. Read that sentence again. The commission alone. Chad wasn't planning to inherit anything down the road. He was planning to sell my ranch out from under me while I was alive, collect his own commission off the top, use my land to bail out his own failing business before I even knew the sign was in the ground. He just didn't know the ground hadn't answered to me alone for 3 years. I'll get to that. I want to tell this in order, the way it happened, because the order matters. 2 years before Opal died, I'd had a scare. A small one. A flutter in my chest during a cattle drive that sent me to the emergency room in Kerrville for a night of monitoring, and a stern lecture about my blood pressure. Nothing came of it medically, but it put a thought in my head I'd never let myself think before. What happens to 1,100 acres if I go down hard and fast, and somebody else decides they know better than me what should happen to it? I drove into San Antonio 2 weeks later and sat down across from Corinne Pettibone for the first time. She was younger then, sharp as a new blade, recommended to me by a rancher friend who'd used her to settle his own father's estate, without a single family member speaking to a judge. I told her what I wanted. I wanted this land to outlive me in a shape nobody could argue with. I wanted it protected from a bad diagnosis, a bad decision, a bad marriage, a bad year. I wanted it protected, frankly, from anybody who might one day look at an old man and see an asset instead of a person. She built me something over the following months. I didn't fully explain it to anybody, not even Opal in detail, though Opal signed what needed signing. She understood the shape of it well enough. An irrevocable land trust, holding the full 1,100 acres. My granddaughter Wren named as the ultimate beneficiary once she came of age. Corinne herself standing as co-trustee alongside me. The 5 acres directly under the house I carved out separately. I placed it under a conservation easement the same year. A legal instrument meaning no sale of that parcel could happen without a court signing off first, no matter whose name was on any later paperwork. I did this 3 years before that morning in the hospital. 3 years before Chad ever planted a sign in grass he thought was still simply mine to sell. I told nobody in the family the details. When it came up at all, I told them Corinne had helped me get my affairs in order. The kind of sentence a man my age says at Thanksgiving that makes everybody nod and change the subject. Nobody wants to think too hard about what it means. Kimberly nodded. Chad nodded harder than anybody, if I'm honest. Already smiling like a man who'd just heard good news he didn't fully understand yet. The ground under that sign hadn't answered to me alone in 3 years. I knew that the whole time Chad stood in a hospital doorway telling me not to worry about a thing. I'm not going to pretend I saw the heart attack coming, or the surgery, or any of the specific days that followed. Nobody sees that coming. What I will tell you is this. I'd spent 3 years building a fence line around exactly this kind of trouble, long before I knew which direction the trouble would come from. I'd learned a long time ago, watching cattle, that you don't wait for the stampede to start building your gate. The morning of the surgery, I remember very little of it clearly. Pain in my chest that didn't feel like pain so much as pressure, like somebody standing on my sternum. Boyd Lassiter, my foreman of 26 years, drove me to the hospital in Kerrville himself. I told him not to call an ambulance and waste the money. Boyd, God love him, ignored half of what I said and called one anyway. Then he followed it in his own truck the whole way to San Antonio, once they decided I needed the bigger cardiac unit. I remember a doctor's face leaning over me, words like blockage and immediate, and we need you to sign this. I remember Kimberly's voice on a phone somewhere nearby, tight and scared in a way that made me believe for a little while that none of what came after was really her fault. I'll come back to that belief, it matters later. I remember going under, and I remember, 9 days later, waking up to a nurse holding a phone and asking me about a sign. That's where we are, that's the whole shape of it, laid out plain. A man who built something with his hands, for 44 years, a wife who told him the truth at a kitchen table before she died, a daughter who went quiet when she should have spoken, a son-in-law who mistook a hospital bed for an empty chair. I hung up that phone in the hospital. I called my lawyer. She said 3 words. Then I lay back against that thin pillow, and I thought about Opal's voice at our kitchen table. Let the ground go to whoever's still standing on it when the dust settles. I intended to still be standing. I just had to get out of that bed first. Getting out of that bed took 4 more days. The cardiologist, a careful young man named Dr. Aldana, told me my heart had thrown a clot during the surgery. The 11 seconds the machines had to bring me back from. He said my body needed rest more than anything else. I told him my body could rest just fine once I knew nobody was selling my land out from under me. He didn't understand that sentence. I didn't explain it. I just nodded along. A compliant patient gets discharged faster than one who argues. Kimberly visited every day. She'd sit in the chair by the window, twisting her wedding ring, asking about my chest, my appetite, my sleep. She never once brought up the sign herself. I noticed that. I filed it away the way you file a steer's ear flick. Not reacting yet, just watching. Chad visited twice in 9 days. The first time he brought flowers already wilting at the edges, the kind you buy at a gas station because you remembered on the drive over. He stood at the foot of my bed and talked for 11 minutes. How relieved he was. How scared Kimberly had been. How the whole family had really pulled together. He did not mention the sign. I didn't bring it up either. I'd already made my call. There wasn't anything left to say to Chad that Corinne wasn't going to say for me, in a much better room, with much better paperwork. The second visit was the one where the tell got louder. He came in on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after I'd hung up on him, holding his phone like it was a shield. "Russ," he said, "I talked to a realtor friend of mine. Honestly, the market right now for a spread your size, we're talking 2 million easy. 2 million, Russ. You could retire completely. No more worrying about fences, no more worrying about anything." I told him I was already retired. I've been retired 6 years. He laughed that same laugh. Retired from the auction business, sure. But you're still out there every day on that ranch, running cattle at 72 years old, with a heart that just about quit on you. Kimberly and I just think, given everything, it might be time to simplify. Simplify. That was his word for it every time. Simplify. Like 1,100 acres, and a business I'd built with 2 hands, and a herd I could read by the flick of an ear, was clutter in a garage that needed clearing out. I looked at him for a long moment. I didn't say anything sharp, I never do. I said, "Chad, who told the realtor to put a sign up?" He shifted his weight. Ear flick, weight back on the haunches. Kimberly signed the listing agreement. As your medical power of attorney. During the emergency. It was completely standard, Russ. Ask anybody. There it was. medical power of attorney. Words he'd clearly rehearsed. Words that sounded official enough to a scared family in a hospital corridor. Words that meant nothing when it came to selling real property. A medical power of attorney has no authority to touch real property in the state of Texas, let alone property that hadn't belonged to me alone on paper for 3 years. I asked him whose signature was actually on that listing agreement. He said Kimberly's. He said it fast, proud almost, like he'd found a clever workaround to a problem I hadn't known I had. I said, "All right." That's all I said. "All right. Understand that's not agreement. That's a rancher recognizing that the fence he already built is about to get tested. There's no reason to argue with the animal before it hits the wire." He left thinking he'd won something. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing what I do best when I can't do anything with my hands. I thought about Kimberly signing that agreement. I wanted badly to believe she'd been scared and confused, standing in a hospital hallway while her husband handed her a stack of papers and a pen, telling her it was standard, it was fine, it was to help her father. I wanted to believe that. She is my daughter. Opal loved her more than anything on this earth. A father wants, even now, even after everything, to find the door that leads back to his own child. But I also thought about the 11 years I'd watched Kimberly get quieter. Every time Chad raised his voice at a family dinner. Watched her stop finishing sentences she used to finish just fine on her own. Watched her learn slowly the way water learns the shape of a container, to agree first and think about it later. That's not weakness exactly. It's a kind of erosion. It happens to strong people too when the pressure's steady enough for long enough. I decided lying in that hospital bed that I would not treat my daughter the way Chad had apparently decided to treat me. I would give her the chance to be the person Opal raised, before I ever gave up on her being that person. But I was not going to give Chad that same chance. Chad had earned exactly what was coming to him. The moment he told his own business partner that my land was basically already his to spend. Boyd Lassiter came to see me on day 7. Boyd's run my ranch foreman's job for 26 years, since he was 34 years old and I was 46. In that time he's seen me through 2 droughts, 1 barn fire, and the death of my wife. Not once in 26 years has that man told me a lie. He sat down heavy in the chair Kimberly usually used. "Russell, I got to tell you something, and I don't like telling it." I told him to spit it out. "That sign went up the day after your surgery," he said. "Not after you were stable. The day after. I watched the truck pull up myself. Watched 2 fellas hammer it into the ground not 30 feet from your porch. I called that lawyer of yours before I even called you. I figured you had enough on your plate with the heart thing." I asked him who else was there. "Chad," Boyd said, standing right there directing them where to put it. Told the installer he wanted it visible from the road. Said something about wanting to, quote, "get ahead of the market before word got around you were sick." Get ahead of the market. Before word got around I was sick. I sat with that sentence for a while. A man will say a lot of things he doesn't mean when he's scared and improvising. But that sentence wasn't scared. That sentence was planned. A man doesn't position a sign for maximum road visibility while his father-in-law is on a table having his chest opened. Not unless he's been thinking about that sign for longer than 9 days. I asked Boyd how long he thought Chad had actually been planning this. Boyd took his hat off. He does that when he's about to say something he's turned over more than once in his own head. "Russell, I heard some things at the feed store a few weeks back. Fella who does trailer work for Chad's brokerage. Mentioned Chad's been talking to some folks about a big commission coming in. Before your surgery. Before anybody knew you were sick. Before anybody knew I was sick." That landed different than the sign itself had landed. The sign was opportunism. Ugly, but at least reactive. A man seeing an opening and jumping through it. But if Chad had been talking about a commission before my heart ever gave out, that wasn't reaction. That was a plan sitting loaded, waiting on a trigger. My heart attack had simply been the trigger that happened to come along first. I didn't say much to Boyd after that. I thanked him. I told him to keep his eyes open and his mouth shut. The same instruction I'd give him before a big sale at the auction barn. "You don't want the room to know what you know until the gavel's already coming down," Corinne called that evening. I remember the exact words. I've turned them over in my head more than a few times since. "Russell," she said. The listing agent called our office before he ever called Chad back. His name is Perry Dunlap. Works out of a shop in San Antonio. Decent enough guy from what I can tell. Not part of whatever Chad's doing on purpose. When his title company ran a preliminary search on the property, ahead of even putting a number on the listing, the deed search flagged the trust and the easement both. He froze the listing immediately, called us to find out what was going on before he embarrassed himself or his brokerage. I asked her what that meant, in plain terms. It means, she said, that as of right now, this afternoon, there is no valid listing on your property. There was never going to be one. Chad or Kimberly or whoever signed that agreement sold something they didn't have the legal authority to sell. Perry Dunlap knows that now. I guess Chad does not know that yet. I asked her if we should tell him. There was a pause. I could hear her smiling through the phone, if that makes any sense. No, she said. Let him find out the way people usually find out things like this. Slowly, and in front of an audience. I liked that answer. I've run enough cattle auctions in my life to know timing is half of everything. You don't announce the top bid the second it comes in. You let the room feel the tension build a little longer. That tension is what makes the final number stick in everybody's memory for years afterward. I asked Corinne one more question before we hung up. I asked her to find out, quietly, whatever she could about Chad's business. Not to be cruel, to understand exactly what kind of pressure was pushing a man to try something this reckless against his own wife's father, while that father was unconscious on an operating table. She said she'd already started looking. That's the kind of lawyer 12 years of retainer checks buys you. Not somebody who waits to be asked twice. I was discharged from the hospital on the 10th day. Boyd drove me home himself, same as he'd driven me in. Neither one of us said much on the 2-hour drive back toward Corrigan Springs. I watched the hill country roll by out the window. The live oaks, the limestone breaking up through the grass. The cattle standing in clusters the way they do in the heat of the day. I thought about how close I'd come to never seeing any of it again. We came up Rimrock Loop Road just after 4 in the afternoon. The sun still high and hard, the way it gets in that country in late spring. I saw the sign before Boyd even slowed the truck down. It was exactly where he'd described it. 30 feet off the porch, angled toward the road for maximum visibility. My ranch's front gate photographed and printed on a glossy panel. A phone number that wasn't mine above a price that wasn't real. There had never been a real transaction underneath it to begin with. Boyd asked if I wanted him to pull it up right then. I told him no. Not yet. I wanted Chad to see me looking at it first. Chad came out to the ranch 3 days after I got home. A Friday evening, unannounced. He'd taken to doing that since the surgery, like a man checking on livestock he already considered his. I was on the porch when his car came up the road, sitting in the chair Opal used to sit in, watching the light go gold over the near pasture. I did not get up. He parked next to the sign, actually parked next to it, like it was a landmark he was proud of. Walked up to the porch with his phone in his hand and a smile that didn't reach the rest of his face. "Russ, you're looking good," he said, colours back in your cheeks. I told him I was healing fine. I asked him to sit. He sat in Opal's chair. I didn't say anything about that. I let it go. The same way you let a green colt get away with one small disrespect before you decide which disrespects you're actually going to correct. "So," he said, rubbing his hands together like a man about to close a deal, "Perry Dunlap tells me there's some kind of hiccup with the title." "Nothing major, just paperwork stuff. I wanted to loop you in before we move forward, since you're feeling better." I asked him what kind of hiccup. "Something about a trust," he said, waving his hand like he was swatting a fly. "Old paperwork, probably outdated by now. Corinne's office is looking into it. But honestly, Russ, we should probably just get everything updated and current so we can move on the sale. The market's not going to wait forever." I let that sit in the air a moment. Then I said, "Chad, that trust isn't outdated. I signed it 3 years ago. It's the only thing that's kept a single person from making decisions about this land besides me." He blinked. First real crack in the smile. "What trust?" he said. I told him, plainly, the way you tell a buyer the true weight of a steer instead of letting them guess low. I told him about the land trust holding all 1,100 acres. Wren named as ultimate beneficiary, Corinne as co-trustee alongside me. I told him about the conservation easement on the 5 acres under the house. Even that parcel couldn't move without a judge signing off first. I told him this had all been in place since 2 years before Opal died, 3 full years before his sign ever went into my grass. He sat very still, the kind of still a man goes when the numbers in his head stop adding up the way he needed them to. That's not, he started, then stopped. That can't be right. Kimberly's the beneficiary. She's your only child. That's how it's supposed to work. It's not how it works, I said. It's how it worked for a while. Before I decided a different way made more sense. I'm allowed to change my mind about my own property, Chad. I did it legally with a lawyer, while I was of entirely sound mind, sitting at my own kitchen table 6 years before anybody suggested otherwise. 6 years before anybody suggested otherwise. I said that part slow. I watched it land. I wanted him to understand exactly what I was telling him. I was telling him I'd seen this exact kind of trouble coming before he was even circling it. I was telling him the fence had been built before the storm. Not during it. Kimberly needs to know about this, he said, standing up now, phone still in his hand like it was a tool he didn't know how to use anymore. Kimberly will know everything, I said. In time. In the right room. He left without saying goodbye. I watched his taillights go down Rimrock Loop Road past the sign. I sat in my own chair a while longer. I thought about Opal. I thought about the letter. I need to tell you about the letter now. It's the part of this story I didn't see coming. Even though I'd built almost everything else with my own 2 hands, years in advance, 2 weeks after that porch conversation, while I was still moving slow and careful, doctor's orders, I decided to clean out the old roll-top desk in my office, the one that used to belong to Opal's father before it belonged to us. I hadn't touched half the drawers in that desk in a decade. I was looking for an old auction ledger. Thought it might help settle a dispute over a fence line with a neighbour. Nothing more romantic than that. In the bottom drawer, under a stack of yellowed receipts from a feed store that closed 20 years ago, I found a manila envelope, sealed with tape that had gone brittle and yellow at the edges. My name was on the front in Opal's handwriting. I sat down at that desk and I opened it slow, the way you open something when you already suspect it's going to change the shape of the rest of your day. Inside was a letter, 4 pages, written the same year our granddaughter Wren was born, 12 years before Opal died. Inside that same envelope was a second, smaller letter, sealed separately, addressed to Wren herself, to be opened when she turned 18. I read my own letter first. Opal wrote about the ranch, about how she'd watched me build it acre by acre, about how proud she was and how worried she was, both at once. The way a person can hold 2 true feelings side by side without either one cancelling the other out. She wrote about watching families in that valley tear themselves apart over land, over money, over who deserved what, about how she never wanted that for us, for Kimberly, for whatever grandchildren might come along. Then she wrote the exact line she'd say to me years later at our kitchen table, in almost the same words, like she'd been rehearsing it half her life before she finally said it out loud where I could hear it. Don't let the land go to whoever's loudest at the table. Let it go to whoever's still standing on it when the dust settles. I sat in that office and read that sentence twice. I understood sitting there that Opal had known this exact kind of trouble was coming a full 12 years before it arrived. Not the specifics, not Chad's name, not the failing brokerage, not the sign in the yard, but the shape of it. The shape of somebody loud trying to claim ground they hadn't earned. And the shape of the quiet answer that shape requires. She trusted me to build the fence when the time came. I only wish she'd been here to see it hold. I set her letter aside. I opened Wren's just far enough to confirm it was sealed properly, still waiting for a 14-year-old girl to turn 18 in her own good time. I didn't read past the first line. Simply, my darling girl, if you're reading this, you're old enough now to understand what your grandfather built and why. I taped it shut again, gentler this time. I put it in the safe deposit box in San Antonio the following week, alongside the trust documents, where it's waited ever since. I called Corinne that same afternoon and told her about the letters. She was quiet for a moment on the phone. Then she said, Russell, I think we bring that letter, your letter, to the reading. Not Wren's, yours. I think the family needs to hear Opal's voice in this before it's over. I agreed. I didn't fully understand yet what the reading was going to look like. I only knew it was coming. The way you know a storm's coming from the colour of the sky an hour before the first drop falls. Boyd came by the following week with the second secret, the one Corinne had been quietly chasing down since that first phone call from the hospital. Russell, he said, sitting on the porch steps instead of the chair this time, like a man who wanted to be lower than me for what he was about to say. You asked me to find out about Chad's business. I asked around some more, talked to my nephew again. My nephew talked to a fella who does the trailer signs for half the real estate offices in San Antonio. I told him to go on. Chad's brokerage lost its two biggest clients back in the winter. Some kind of falling out my nephew wasn't clear on details. But here's the thing, Russell. Chad had already signed his own name, personal guarantee, on a lease for a second office suite. $161,000 over the life of the lease. With those two clients gone, there's nobody left paying rent on that space but Chad himself, out of his own pocket, which he apparently does not have. $161,000. I sat with that number. The landlord's lawyer sent a letter, Boyd went on, demanding payment or eviction, and a lawsuit. Within, best my nephew could figure, about 8 weeks from around the time you had your surgery. 8 weeks from around the time I had my surgery. I thought about the sign again. Get ahead of the market. Before word got around I was sick. I thought about the commission Chad had allegedly been bragging about to his own business partner, weeks before my heart ever gave out. Now I had a number to put underneath all of it. $161,000. 8 weeks. Ticking down like a fuse, Chad had lit himself, hoping my land would put it out before it reached him. I asked Boyd if Kimberly knew any of this. He said he didn't think so. Said the fella at the sign shop had specifically mentioned Chad kept telling people not to mention it around his wife's side of things. That told me plenty. About how carefully Chad had been managing the story on both ends, keeping Kimberly in the dark about his own trouble while using her signature to try and solve it. That's the moment, sitting on my own porch with Boyd Lassiter, hearing a number I hadn't asked to hear, that I stopped feeling anything close to sympathy for Chad Ostrander. I could forgive a scared man doing something foolish under pressure. I could not forgive a man who'd built the pressure himself in secret, and then reached for my land like it was a rope thrown to a drowning swimmer he'd pushed into the water himself. I decided that week I wasn't going to wait for him to come to me again. I was going to arrange the room myself, the way I used to arrange a sale barn before a big auction. Let him walk into it, not knowing what was already sitting on the table. I called Corinne. I told her I wanted a family dinner. I told her I wanted her there. She said, "Russell, are you sure? Your heart's still healing." I told her my heart had been healing for 6 years. Ever since Opal died. This particular piece of business was going to help more than it hurt. She said she'd clear her calendar. I want to back up here and tell you a little more about Kimberly. I don't want you thinking I'd already written her off as lost. I hadn't. I want to be plain about that. My daughter was not born quiet. She was a loud, opinionated little girl. Used to stand on the top rail of the corral fence and holler instructions at ranch hands twice her age about how they were doing it wrong. Opal used to laugh and say Kimberly came out of the womb already knowing her own mind. For the first 20-some years of her life, that was true. Something changed after she married Chad. Not all at once. A little at a time, the way a fence post leans a degree a year, until one day you notice the whole line's gone crooked and you can't remember which year it started. I watched it happen at family dinners over a decade. Kimberly would start to make a point. Some small thing. Which restaurant to pick, whether to visit his family or mine for a holiday. Chad would talk over her, gently at first, then not so gently. She'd stop mid-sentence and let him finish the thought for her. I watched her stop finishing her own sentences in front of him 100 times before I ever said a word about it. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place. A grown woman gets to choose her own marriage, even if her father doesn't love the shape of it. I've thought a lot since the surgery about whether that restraint was wisdom or cowardice on my part. I still don't have a clean answer. I know this much. I wasn't going to let it cost her the chance to come back to herself. Not once she understood clearly what her husband had actually done. I called her myself, 2 days before the dinner I'd asked Corinne to attend. Not through Chad. Direct, on her cell phone. The way I used to call her when she was in college, and needed to hear her father's voice for no particular reason. "Dad," she said, surprised, "is everything okay?" "Your heart." "My heart's fine," I said. "I want you to come to dinner Sunday. Just family. I want to talk about some things." There was a pause. In that pause, I heard something I hadn't heard from my daughter in a long time. Uncertainty that wasn't about me, uncertainty about herself. "Chad mentioned there was some kind of paperwork issue," she said carefully, "with the ranch." "There's no issue," I said. "There's clarity. I want to give you both that clarity in person. I want Corinne there when I do it. Some of it involves your mother." I want it said right. She agreed to come. I could hear underneath the words that she was scared. Underneath the fear, something else too. A kind of hope, maybe, that whatever was coming might finally be honest. Sunday came. I'd asked Corinne to arrive an hour early, and she did. Sitting with me at the kitchen table, the same table Opal had sat me down at years before. Going over the documents one more time. Not because either of us needed the review. Ritual matters before a big sale. And this was the biggest sale of my life, even though nothing was actually being sold. Boyd came too at my invitation, standing quietly by the kitchen counter, the way he'd stood at the edge of 100 cattle pens over 26 years. Present, watching. Ready to speak if I called on him, and silent if I didn't. Chad and Kimberly arrived at 6. Chad walked in first, same rehearsed smile from the porch, a bottle of wine in his hand like this was any other Sunday. Kimberly followed a step behind him. I noticed right away she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the table, at the folder sitting square in front of my plate, at Corinne sitting where Opal used to sit. We ate. I want to tell you that part honestly because it wasn't dramatic yet. We ate a pot roast I'd had Boyd's wife help me cook, because my own cooking's never been much. We talked about small things. Wren's schoolwork, a drought forecast for the coming summer. Nothing that mattered, while the folder sat there the whole time, like a held breath. Chad brought it up himself eventually, over dessert, the way I knew he would. A man like Chad can't leave a silence alone for long if he thinks there's an angle he hasn't played yet. "So," he said, setting down his fork, "Corinne, I understand there's some kind of trust situation with the property. I think it'd be helpful if you could just walk us through it so we can figure out the best path forward for everybody." Corinne looked at me. I nodded. She opened the folder. 3 years ago, she said, in the same calm, even voice she uses for everything, whether she's discussing the weather or dismantling a man's entire plan in front of his family, Russell established an irrevocable land trust holding the full 1,100 acres of the Hargrove Ranch. The beneficiary named in that trust is Wren Ostrander, upon her 18th birthday, with Russell and myself serving as co-trustees until that date. Separately, that same year, Russell placed the 5 acres beneath the house under a permanent conservation easement. This restricts any transfer of that parcel without judicial approval, regardless of who holds a power of attorney or any other authorization at the time. The kitchen went quiet. I watched Chad's face while she said it. I've watched a lot of faces at auction. Watched men realize in real time that the number they'd budgeted for was about to be blown past by somebody with deeper pockets. There's a particular look that crosses a face in that moment, and a kind of arithmetic happening behind the eyes, fast and involuntary. That's the look Chad had. "That can't," he started. "I mean, that doesn't override Kimberly's rights as your daughter, does it? As next of kin." "It's not about overriding anyone's rights," Corinne said. "It's simply that Russell chose 6 years ago, while entirely competent, to structure his estate a certain way. The property was never his to sell alone after that. It was certainly never within the authority of a medical power of attorney to list for sale, which is a separate legal instrument entirely, and does not extend to real property transactions under Texas law." Kimberly hadn't said a word yet. I watched her looking at the folder, then at Chad, then at her own hands. "Chad," she said finally, quiet. "You told me the power of attorney covered this. You told me it was standard." "It should have," he said, and I heard the ear flick in his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. "I mean, that's what the form said. That's what the guy at the office told me." "What guy?" Kimberly said. "I want you to notice that question." That's the first crack of my daughter's own voice coming back. The first sentence in a long time where she wasn't waiting for Chad to finish the thought for her. Chad didn't answer right away. Corinne did, gently, the way you deliver a hard number to a nervous bidder. "Kimberly," she said, "I'd encourage you to ask your husband directly later, in private, about a consultation he arranged a few weeks before your father's surgery, with a physician he found through a referral service, for what's sometimes called a capacity evaluation. I'm not going to characterize it further tonight. I'll simply say that document exists, it's dated, and Russell has a copy." I hadn't told Kimberly about the capacity evaluation yet. I'd been saving it, the way you save your best animal for last at auction. I wanted her to hear it from Corinne, in this room, in front of Chad. Not from me privately, where Chad could still work on her afterward and soften the shape of what it meant. Kimberly turned to look at her husband. I watched something go still in her face. the particular stillness of a person doing arithmetic on their own marriage in real time. You had a doctor evaluate my father's competency, she said, without telling me, before his surgery. It was precautionary, Chad said. Everybody does this kind of thing, Kim. It's just responsible planning. Did you pay for it? She asked. He didn't answer for a moment too long. $750, Corinne said quietly. Into the silence he left, paid from an account in Chad's name, 3 weeks before Russell's surgery. The physician in question has, since being contacted by our office, confirmed he never actually examined Russell in person. The report was never completed. The bill was paid regardless. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since. I did not feel triumphant. I felt something closer to grief, watching my daughter's face, understand, piece by piece, exactly what kind of man she'd built a life with. I'd spent 11 years hoping I was wrong about the shape of that fence post leaning. I wasn't wrong, I just hadn't wanted to be right. Chad tried one more angle. A man like Chad always has one more angle, right up until the moment there genuinely aren't any left. Russell, he said, turning to me directly for the first time all evening, I want you to know, whatever this looks like, I was trying to help this family. The market's not going to stay this good forever. I was thinking about Kimberly's future, about Wren's future. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. I thought about 80 leased acres and a 9-year-old boy watching a family's furniture loaded into a truck in the rain. I thought about 30 years of Opal's handwriting in a set of ledgers upstairs. I thought about $161,000 and 8 weeks and a landlord's lawyer somewhere in San Antonio, already drafting a letter. Chad, I said, I don't raise my voice. I read The Herd. I've been reading yours since the day that sign went up in my yard. Maybe longer, if I'm honest with myself. You weren't thinking about Kimberly's future. Or Wren's. You were thinking about $161,000 you personally guaranteed on an office lease you can't fill, and a landlord who's about 8 weeks from suing you into the ground. The room went very still. How? Chad started, and then stopped. There wasn't really a way to finish that question that didn't confirm exactly what I'd just said. I have a foreman who talks to people, I said. I have a lawyer who's very good at her job. I have 44 years of experience reading a man who's about to bolt before he even knows he's going to do it. I let that sit in the room. I've learned over decades of running a sale barn that silence after a hard number does more work than any speech you could give on top of it. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full minute. Wren wasn't at that dinner, I should say. She was 13 at the time, staying at a friend's house that Sunday. I was grateful for it. Some rooms aren't for children, even sharp ones, even ones with their names sitting quiet in a trust document upstairs. Kimberly was the one who finally broke the silence. I want to see the doctor's bill, she said to Corinne, and I want to see the listing agreement I signed. All of it. Corinne slid the folder across the table. Kimberly read it slowly, page by page. I watched her face change with each one, the way you watch weather change over the hill country, her front moving in from a direction you didn't expect. When she got to the listing agreement, she stopped and read one section twice. This says a 6% commission, she said, on an assumed sale price of $2,100,000. That's correct, Corinne said. Kimberly looked up at Chad. That's $126,000, she said. That's almost exactly what you owe on the office lease. I want to give my daughter credit here. That math was hers. Not mine, not Corinne's. Kimberly had always been quick with numbers. Quicker than Chad in some ways, though she'd let herself stop showing it somewhere along the way. She did that math out loud, in real time, in front of everybody. I watched something in her spine straighten that I hadn't seen straighten in years. It's not exactly like that, Chad said. Then tell me what it's exactly like, Kimberly said. He didn't have an answer. I've sat across a lot of nervous buyers in my life. Men who talk fast when the numbers stop working in their favour. Chad had officially run out of fast talk. He sat there with his mouth slightly open, looking for a sentence that wasn't going to come. There wasn't one. The math was the math. I decided, watching that it was time to bring Opal into the room. I asked Corinne to hand me the letter. She'd brought it in her own folder, sealed in a protective sleeve. The same 4 pages I'd found in that roll-top desk. I'd asked her days before to keep it close for exactly this moment. I opened it slow. Your mother wrote this 12 years before she died. I said to Kimberly. I found it 2 weeks ago, cleaning out a desk. I want to read you a part of it. I read most of the letter. I'm not going to give you every word here. Some of it was between me and Opal, and I intend to keep it that way, even telling this story to strangers. But I read the part about watching families tear themselves apart over land, and I read, slow, the line she'd told me herself years later at that same table. Don't let the land go to whoever's loudest at the table, I read. Let it go to whoever's still standing on it when the dust settles. Kimberly was crying by the time I finished. Not the loud kind, quiet. The kind that comes when a person finally understands something they'd been avoiding understanding for a long time. She wrote that when I was a baby, Kimberly said. 12 years before any of this. She saw something coming, I said. She didn't know the specifics. Neither did I. Not really, not the exact shape of it. But we both knew, eventually, somebody was going to test whether this family holds together under weight or falls apart under it. I built the trust to make sure that whatever happened to the two of us, the land itself would land somewhere safe, no matter how the test came out. I looked at her directly then. I built it for Ren, I said, but I also built it, if I'm honest, hoping I'd never have to explain why. Chad tried to speak again, something about how this was all a misunderstanding, how he loved this family, how he'd never meant any harm. I let him talk for a minute. A man deserves at least that much before the gavel comes down. But Kimberly cut him off. This time her voice didn't waver at all. Chad, she said, did you know about Dad's heart condition before the surgery? Before the flutter he had 2 years before Mum died? That's not, he said. I mean, yes, everybody in the family knew about that. Russ mentioned it. So you knew he'd already had one scare, Kimberly said, and you still hired a doctor to question his competency. 3 weeks before a scheduled procedure that everybody in this family understood carried real risk. You did that without telling me. You paid $750 for it. The same week, you put a for sale sign in my father's yard while he was still under anesthesia. She wasn't asking questions anymore. She was laying it out. The way Corinne had laid out the trust. Plain and factual. I felt something in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. Pride, maybe. Or relief. The particular relief of watching a fence post you'd worried was leaning past savings straighten itself back up on its own, given enough time and the right kind of pressure applied from the right direction. I want to know one more thing, Kimberly said to Chad. The office lease. The $161,000. When were you going to tell me about that? He didn't answer. Were you ever going to tell me? She said. Or was the plan just to quietly sell my father's ranch and pay it off before I noticed the debt existed at all? Still nothing from him. I watched a marriage end at that kitchen table. Not with shouting, not with anything dramatic, the way movies show these things. With a series of quiet, unanswerable questions, each one landing a little heavier than the last, until there was simply nothing left standing. I want to be careful here because I don't take pleasure in a marriage ending, even one built on ground this shaky. I'll tell you honestly, I did not orchestrate that part. I orchestrated the reveal of the trust, the letter, the timing of the dinner. I did not orchestrate my daughter finally seeing her husband clearly. That part she did herself. Once the facts were finally laid out where she could see them, without Chad's voice talking over the top of them. Chad left that night around 9. He didn't say much on his way out. Kimberly didn't walk him to the car. She stayed at the ranch that night, in her old room, the one that still had a few of her childhood things in the closet. Ribbons from 4-H competitions, a photograph of her at 16, standing next to a steer she'd raised herself and sold at auction for a record price that year. The auction I'd run myself, calling her own number out over the microphone with more pride than I let show at the time. We talked late into the night. I told her everything I hadn't told her yet, about the capacity evaluation, about the timeline Boyd had pieced together, about how long I believed Chad might have been planning something like this before the surgery ever gave him his opening. He told his business partner I had more land than I'd ever use, I said. Before I was even sick, Kimberly. Before there was anything to be sick about. She sat with that a long while. I think I knew something was wrong, she said finally. I think I've known for a while. I just kept telling myself it was normal, that every marriage has hard stretches, that I was being dramatic if I paid too much attention to the small things. What small things? I asked. The way he'd finish my sentences, she said. The way I stopped arguing even when I thought I was right. I told myself I was being a good partner. I think I was just tired. I didn't say anything to that. I let it sit. Some things a father can't fix with a sentence, no matter how true the sentence is. Some things a daughter has to arrive at on her own time. In her own words, all a father can do is be standing there, steady, when she finally gets there. The following weeks moved faster than I expected. Kimberly filed for divorce inside a month. On her own, with her own lawyer, not Corinne. She told me she wanted to build something for herself in this that wasn't leaning on my shoulder the way she'd leaned on Chad's for 11 years. I respected that more than I could say. Chad's business troubles, meanwhile, didn't wait politely for his marriage to finish falling apart before landing on top of him too. The landlord's lawsuit came through 3 weeks after that dinner, exactly as Boyd's information had suggested it would, demanding the full $161,000, plus another $12,000 in legal fees. Chad had no way to pay it, no ranch left to quietly liquidate to cover it. The lawsuit became public record, the way these things do, filed in a Bexar County courthouse, where anybody willing to look could find it. That's when the second consequence found him, the one none of us had engineered directly, the one that simply happened because the ground underneath a Matida lie can only hold weight for so long before it gives way on its own. A reporter for a small business journal in San Antonio, the kind of publication that covers commercial real estate, the way a farm paper covers cattle prices, picked up the lawsuit filing, started asking questions about Chad's brokerage. In the course of that reporting, somebody, I never learned exactly who, mentioned the capacity evaluation Chad had arranged for me. The one the physician confirmed had never actually happened, despite being paid for. I didn't ask for that story to run. I want to be honest about that. Corinne hadn't leaked it, Boyd hadn't leaked it, and I certainly hadn't called any reporter myself. But once a lawsuit becomes public, and a man's finances start unravelling in front of people who talk to each other for a living, the rest of the story has a way of finding daylight on its own. The same way water always finds the lowest point in a field, no matter how carefully you've graded it. The Texas Real Estate Commission opened an inquiry into Chad's brokerage license within the month, once the fabricated medical evaluation became part of the public record. I heard secondhand, through Boyd, through the same feed store network that had first brought me the number $161,000, that the commission froze $44,000, sitting in one of Chad's escrow accounts pending the review. Standard procedure, Corinne told me, whenever a broker's conduct comes into serious question. I didn't feel joy at any of that. I want to be honest about that too. I felt something closer to the feeling you get watching a fence post that's been leaning for years finally fall over on its own, in a storm you didn't cause. Underweight it had been carrying wrong the whole time. Sad in a way, inevitable in another way. Not something I'd wish on a man exactly, but not something I felt any responsibility to prevent either. I thought, after that Sunday dinner, that the worst of it was behind me. I was wrong, though not in the way you might expect. What came next wasn't Chad reaching for the ranch again, not directly. It was something slower. In its own way, harder to sit through, because it stretched out over months instead of landing all at once. Chad's lawyer sent a letter to Corinne's office 3 weeks after the dinner, a sharp young associate, out of a San Antonio firm that specializes in exactly this kind of mess. The letter claimed Kimberly's signature on the listing agreement had been given under reasonable belief of valid authority. It said that entitled Chad to compensation for what he called services rendered in good faith toward the family's estate planning. I laughed out loud when Corinne read me that phrase over the phone. Services rendered in good faith. A man plants a sign in my yard the day after my heart stops on an operating table, hires a doctor to lie about my competency, and calls it services rendered. Corinne didn't laugh. She's more careful than I am about these things. That's exactly why I pay her what I pay her. It's nothing, she told me. It won't survive a first filing. But I want you to understand something, Russell. Men like Chad don't stop reaching just because the first reach failed. They test a new angle, see if anybody flinches. If nobody flinches, they move to the next angle after that. I told her I didn't flinch at auctions and I wasn't going to start flinching now. She filed a response within the week, polite, factual, and utterly devastating, from what she described to me afterward. It laid out the timeline of the fabricated capacity evaluation, the unauthorized listing agreement, and the beginning of a state licensing board inquiry that had just started at that point. It invited Chad's attorney to reconsider whether pursuing any further claim against the estate was truly in his client's best interest. given what a court filing would put on the public record in even greater detail than what already existed. The claim disappeared within days. I never heard about it again. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't, not quite. Chad tried one more angle after that, smaller and meaner than the first. The kind of move a man makes when he's out of good options and starting to reach for bad ones out of pure desperation. Boyd brought me the word first, the way he'd brought me most of the hard news in this whole business. He came by the house on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands. By then I understood that meant something worth sitting down for. "Russell," he said, words going around town that Chad's been telling folks at the feed store and the diner that you cut Kimberly out of your will entirely. Says the whole 1,100 acres skips straight to Wren, and Kimberly gets nothing, not even the house. Says you did it out of spite, punishing her for marrying him in the first place. I felt something cold move through me at that. Colder than anything Chad had managed to make me feel up to that point. Not because it threatened anything real. The trust documents spoke for themselves and weren't going to change no matter what Chad said at a diner counter. Because it was aimed directly at hurting Kimberly, at driving a wedge between us during the exact month she needed her father the most. "That's a lie," I said. "Kimberly knows the truth. She was in the room for the reading. Well, she will be, once we schedule it." "I know that, and you know that," Boyd said. "But half of Corrigan Springs doesn't know that. Chad's telling it to anybody who'll buy him a coffee. And listen. My guess he's trying to make himself look like the wronged party before word gets any further around about the licensing inquiry." I called Corinne that same afternoon. She was quieter than usual on the phone. For her, that means she's genuinely angry, not merely irritated. "It's not actionable in any meaningful way," she said. "Gossip rarely is, unless it crosses into something specific and provably false that causes measurable harm. And even then, it's a slow, expensive road nobody wants to walk for its own sake. But Russell, I don't think the answer here is a lawsuit. I think the answer is the same as it's always been with you. Let the truth stand where people can see it. In a room. On the record. Let it do the correcting on its own." That's when I decided to move the reading up. I'd originally planned it for my 73rd birthday. Still some months off. I wanted to give Kimberly's divorce time to settle first so the reading wouldn't feel tangled up in the middle of it. But Chad's whisper campaign changed my calculation. I didn't want my daughter walking around town for another 6 months, underneath a lie he was telling about her own inheritance. While he told himself it made him look sympathetic, I also decided, around the same time, to do something I hadn't originally planned. I decided to make part of the reading semi-public. Not the trust documents themselves. Those stayed private in Corinne's office. Family only. But the underlying facts about the listing agreement and the capacity evaluation. I wanted them on the record somewhere Chad couldn't quietly whisper his own version over the top of. Somewhere that would outlast a rumour at a diner counter. Corinne suggested the right vehicle herself. The State Real Estate Licensing Board's inquiry, already underway because of the lawsuit filing, required a formal response from our side documenting exactly what had happened with the listing agreement. The board needed to determine whether Chad's conduct constituted a violation of his fiduciary duties as a licensed broker, quite apart from anything involving his relationship to me personally. "If you're willing," Corinne said, "we can submit a full sworn statement. Timeline, documents, the physician's confirmation that he never actually examined you. It becomes part of the board's official record. It's not a courtroom, there's no judge banging a gavel, but it is public record once the board's process concludes. Reporters who cover that industry do occasionally look at those filings." I told her to prepare it. I signed the sworn statement 2 weeks later, in her office, with Boyd there as a witness to corroborate the parts of the timeline he'd pieced together himself. It ran 9 pages. It named the doctor. It named the dollar amount he'd been paid. It named the date the sign went up relative to the date of my surgery, established through Boyd's own eyewitness account, and the sign company's installation records, which Corinne had subpoenaed as part of the board's process. Filing that statement felt different than the dinner had. The dinner was private, a family reckoning contained within 4 walls, and a handful of people who loved each other, or had once loved each other. The sworn statement was different, permanent, in a way the dinner conversation, however devastating, never fully could be. Once it sat in a state licensing board's file, it existed independent of anybody's memory or anybody's willingness to keep telling the truth about what happened. It would outlast gossip. It would outlast Chad's version of events at the diner counter. It would sit there, plain and factual, for as long as anyone cared to look. I want to tell you something about how that felt. Signing my name to 9 pages of plain facts in a lawyer's office. It felt like pouring concrete. You mix it, you pour it, you screed it level, and then you wait. Concrete that hasn't cured yet isn't worth anything, no matter how good it looks the day you pour it. I signed that statement, and I understood I was pouring something that would need time to cure before it did its real work. But I also understood, the way you understand about concrete after 40 years of working with it, that once it's set, nothing Chad said at any diner counter in Texas was going to crack it. The board's process took another 2 months to formally conclude. In the meantime, the reading happened. Moved up from my birthday to a Saturday in late autumn, 5 months after the surgery instead of the original 6. Kimberly's divorce, though not yet finalised, was far enough along that she came to that reading as a woman clearly building her own life again, rather than one still tangled inside somebody else's version of it. There's one more piece of that stretch of months I need to tell you about. It's the part that finally put the whole business to rest in the eyes of the town. Not just the eyes of a licensing board sitting somewhere in Austin. Most folks in Corrigan Springs would never think to look up. Perry Dunlap, the listing agent whose title search had first flagged the trust, called me himself about 6 weeks before the reading. I hadn't expected to hear from him again. As far as I was concerned, he'd done his job the moment he froze that listing and called Corinne. He owed me nothing further. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, "I want to apologise for my part in this, even though I didn't know the full shape of it at the time. And I want to tell you something you might want to know, since it's likely to come up regardless." He told me Chad had approached 2 other agencies in San Antonio in the weeks after the first listing froze, tried to get the ranch relisted through a different broker. In one case, presenting himself as though he still held valid authority over the property, without mentioning the trust at all. Both agencies, Perry told me, had run their own preliminary title checks, standard practice in commercial real estate once a deal size gets past a certain threshold. Both had turned up the same red flags his own search had. One agency's compliance officer had gone further, filed an internal report flagging Chad's conduct as a potential violation. Misrepresenting authority to list a property is taken seriously in that industry. Seriously enough, that word of it had apparently made its way, informally, to the very licensing board already reviewing his file for the capacity evaluation matter. "I wanted you to hear it from me," Perry said, rather than second hand. "He wasn't just trying once, Mr. Hargrove. He tried 3 times that I know of. Maybe more that I don't." I thanked him for calling. Hearing that news didn't make me angrier than I already was. If anything, it settled something in me. The way a scale settling on the right weight settles an argument you've been having with a buyer who swore your steer weighed less than it did. Chad hadn't stumbled into one bad decision under pressure. He'd made the same bad decision 3 separate times, methodically, each time hoping a different agency wouldn't look as closely as the last one had. I told Corinne about it. She added it, with Perry's written consent, to the sworn statement already sitting in front of the licensing board, strengthening what had already been a strong filing into something closer to undeniable. Word did travel through Corrigan Springs after that, the way word always travels through a small town, faster and more thoroughly than anybody who started the rumour ever expects. Not because I told anybody, not because Boyd told anybody beyond what he'd already told me in confidence. It travelled because Chad himself, trying to get ahead of his own unravelling story at the diner counter, had told too many people too many different versions of events. Small towns are merciless about cataloguing exactly which version a man tells to which audience. By the time the reading finally happened, most of Corrigan Springs already understood, in broad strokes, that the whisper campaign about Kimberly being cut out of the will was Chad's invention, not my decision, and that the real story ran considerably worse for him than the one he'd been telling. I didn't need to correct a single person myself. The truth did what truth generally does, given enough time and enough people paying enough attention. It outlasted the lie that tried to get ahead of it. I want to pause here and tell you something about Wren, because these months mattered for her too, in ways I didn't fully appreciate until later. She was living, by then, in the small rented house with Kimberly, closer to me than she'd ever lived. She started coming out to the ranch most weekends, riding along with Boyd on his morning rounds, learning to read a fence line for weak spots the way I'd taught her mother to do at that same age, 30 years earlier. She asked me one Saturday morning, sitting on the tailgate of Boyd's truck while he checked a water trough, why Chad had done what he did. I thought about how to answer a 13-year-old honestly without frightening her. Some people, I told her, get scared of a debt they can't pay. Instead of telling the truth about it, they start looking for somebody else's ground to stand on. It doesn't usually work. Ground that isn't yours has a way of giving out from under you eventually. She thought about that for a while, the way she thinks about most things, slow and careful. Is that why you built the trust? She asked. So nobody could ever do that to you. Or to me. Partly, I said. Mostly I built it because your grandmother told me to make sure the land went to whoever was still standing on it when the dust settled. I just didn't know back then that it'd end up being you standing there. I hoped it would be. I didn't know it for certain. I'm going to stay standing here, she said. There wasn't a shred of doubt in her voice when she said it. The particular confidence of a 13-year-old who hasn't yet learned all the ways the world can test that kind of certainty. I hoped, sitting on that tailgate, that the world would be gentler to her certainty than it had been to some of the rest of ours. The week before the reading, Corinne called me with one more piece of news. The kind that arrives right before a big sale and makes you double-check every number on your own side of the ledger one last time before the gavel falls. The licensing board's investigator called me directly, she said. They want to know if you'd be willing to have someone from their office present at the reading. Not to participate, just to observe, since the timeline you're establishing corroborates what they've already gathered independently. It's unusual but not unheard of when the facts of a family matter and a licensing matter overlap this closely. I thought about it for a day before I answered. Part of me wanted to keep that Saturday small, family only, the way I'd originally pictured it years earlier, sitting down with Corinne to plan it. But I thought about Chad's whisper campaign at the diner counter, about how a private family reading, however devastating in the room, could still be quietly rewritten afterward, by a man who'd already proven 3 times over that he was willing to keep trying a lie even after it failed. I told Corinne yes, have them send someone. The investigator's name was Denise Ferris, a quiet, careful woman who arrived early, introduced herself to everyone in the room, sat near the back with a legal pad, saying almost nothing the entire afternoon, though I noticed her writing steadily the whole time Corinne read through the sworn statement. Her presence changed the temperature of that room in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. It was one thing for Chad to sit through a family reckoning, however painful, among people who'd once loved him. People who might, in some quiet corner of themselves, still have wanted to find a way to forgive him. It was another thing entirely for him to sit through the same reckoning with a state official, taking careful notes a few feet away. Notes that would become part of an official record, independent of anybody's feelings in that room. I watched him notice her, early on, glance her way more than once. I watched something in his posture change once he understood exactly what her presence meant. Whatever version of events he'd been planning to offer, whatever softened, sympathetic account he might have delivered to a room of family alone, he understood now that it would be measured, afterward, against a sworn statement and a corroborating investigator's notes. That measuring would happen in a place well beyond Corrigan Springs, in an office in Austin where nobody had ever met him, bought him a coffee, or cared one way or another how sympathetic he managed to sound. I tell you this because I think it's the piece that finally settled things past any hope of Chad rewriting the story afterward. A dinner table reckoning can fade into family legend, retold differently by different people over the years, softened here, sharpened there, depending on who's telling it and why. A sworn statement corroborated by an independent investigator sitting in the room while it's read doesn't soften. It sits in a file, plain and permanent. The way a poured foundation sits under a house, long after everyone who watched it get poured has forgotten the particular Tuesday it happened. That's the room Chad walked into 15 minutes late that Saturday. Not just a family, a record. The reading happened on a Saturday afternoon in late autumn, 5 months after the surgery, in Corinne's office on Houston Street in San Antonio. A conference room with a long table and windows looking out over the river. I'd invited Kimberly, whose divorce from Chad was most of the way through by then. She was living by that point in a small rented house in Corrigan Springs with Wren, closer to me than she'd lived in over a decade. I'd invited Boyd, who'd earned the right to be in that room a dozen times over by then. I'd invited Wren herself. She was 13 going on 14. She understood enough of what had happened to know it mattered, even if she didn't yet know exactly what was in the papers. I had not invited Chad. Corinne had informed his attorney that a family document reading was occurring, as a courtesy, given the pending divorce proceedings and the trust's original structure. She told him he was welcome to attend as a courtesy, not as a right. He held no interest whatsoever in the trust itself. He came anyway. I watched him walk into that conference room 15 minutes late, wearing a suit that looked newer than it should have, given everything Boyd had told me about his finances. I felt for just a moment something close to pity. Not much. Enough to notice it was there. Corinne handled it the way she handles everything, with a calm that never once tipped into cruelty, even when cruelty would have been earned. Chad, she said, you're welcome to observe. But I want to be clear, this reading concerns Russell's trust and estate plan, none of which involves you directly. If at any point you'd like to step out, that's entirely your choice. He said he understood. He sat at the far end of the table, alone. Watching him sit there, I thought about the auction barn again, about the way a room clears out fast once a buyer's credit stops being good. The same men who'd shake your hand and buy you a beer when you were flush. They find somewhere else to stand once word gets around. You can't cover a bid. Corinne read through the trust documents first, formally, for the record. Everyone in the room besides Wren already understood the broad shape of what they said. 1,100 acres, held in trust. Wren as ultimate beneficiary at 18. Myself and Corinne as co-trustees until then. The conservation easement on the 5 acres beneath the house. Permanent. It protects the home itself from any future sale, no matter who might one day hold power of attorney over my affairs. Then she opened Opal's letter to me, the one I'd found in the roll-top desk. She read it into the record in its entirety, for the first time in front of everybody, including the parts I hadn't shared at the dinner table. I won't repeat all of it here either, but I'll tell you the room was quiet the whole way through. The particular quiet a room goes when everyone present understands they're hearing something meant to outlast the person who wrote it. When Corinne finished, she looked at Wren. Your grandmother wrote you a letter too, she said. Sealed, addressed to you, to be opened on your 18th birthday. It's being held in a safe deposit box until then, alongside the trust documents. I wanted you to know it exists, even though today isn't the day you get to read it. Wren, God bless that girl, didn't cry, though I think she wanted to. She just nodded, very seriously. The way a 13-year-old nods when she's decided a piece of information is important enough to carry carefully, rather than react loudly. I'll wait, she said. I'm good at waiting. I laughed at that, the first real laugh I'd had in months. You get that from your grandmother, I told her. She was the most patient woman I ever knew, right up until the moment patience stopped being the right tool for the job. Then Corinne moved to the last item on her agenda, the one I'd asked her to save for the end. I wanted it to land after everything else, once the room already understood the full weight of what had been protected and why. There's one more matter, she said, and I want the record to reflect it clearly, since Chad is present, and it concerns him directly, even though it isn't part of the trust itself. She laid out for the room the full sworn statement. 9 pages, already filed with the State Real Estate Licensing Board. She read the physician's confirmation aloud, the one stating flatly that he had never actually examined me, that the capacity evaluation report had never been completed, that the $750 fee had been paid regardless. She read the timeline of the sign's installation, corroborated by the company's own records, showing it had gone up the day after my surgery, arranged and paid for before the surgery had even occurred. She noted for the record Perry Dunlap's account of the 2 additional agencies Chad had approached afterward, each turning up the same trust and easement his own listing agreement had ignored. Chad sat very still through all of it. I watched him the whole time, the way I'd watch a steer in a chute I didn't fully trust yet, waiting to see which way the pressure would break him. I have a right to respond to this, he said when Corinne finished. You do, she said. This isn't a courtroom, Chad, and nobody here is compelling any statement from you. But if you'd like to say something for the record, you're welcome to. He stood up. I'll give him this much. He had nerve, standing up in a room full of people who by then understood exactly what he'd done. I made mistakes, he said again, the same line he'd used at the dinner months before, like it was the only sentence he had left in his pocket. I was scared about my business. I thought, if I could just get ahead of things quietly, nobody would have to know how bad it had gotten. I never meant for anybody to get hurt. Not Russell, not Kimberly, not Wren. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. I thought about $161,000, and a doctor paid $750 to lie. A sign hammered into my grasp the day after my heart stopped on a table. 3 separate agencies he'd tried the same lie on, after the first one caught him. Chad, I said, I've made plenty of mistakes in 73 years. I'll own every one of them, but I never once tried to convince a doctor to say my own father was too confused to run his life, so I could sell something out from under him while he couldn't stop me. I never tried it a second time, after getting caught the first time. I never tried it a third. That's not a mistake, Chad. That's a plan, tested 3 times over. The difference matters more than you seem willing to admit, even now, in a room where everybody already knows the truth of it. The room stayed very quiet after that. I don't raise my voice, I said. Quieter now. Mostly to myself, though I know everyone heard it. I read the herd. And I read yours a long time before that sign ever went up, if I'm honest with myself. I just hoped I was wrong. I wasn't. Chad didn't say anything else after that. He left before the meeting formally closed. As far as I know, none of us in that room have spoken to him since, except through lawyers, and only when the divorce paperwork required it. Kimberly walked me to my truck afterward, out in the parking lot, along the river, the November light already going long and gold the way it does in that part of Texas in late afternoon. Dad, she said, I want to say something, and I don't want you to make it easy for me because I don't think I've earned easy yet. I told her to go ahead. I let this happen, she said. Not the doctor thing, not the sign. I didn't know about either of those until you told me. But I let myself get small in that marriage for 11 years. I stopped trusting my own read on people, including my own husband, because it was easier than admitting I might have made a mistake marrying him. That smallness is part of why he thought he could get away with what he tried. He didn't think I'd ask hard questions. For 11 years, he was right not to think that. I didn't rush to tell her it wasn't her fault. Some of it, in fact, wasn't hers to carry. And some of it, in the honest accounting my whole life has taught me to keep, probably was. I've learned that the truest kindness you can offer somebody you love is an honest ledger, not a false one built to make them feel better in the moment. You asked good questions the night it mattered, I told her instead. You did the math on the commission yourself. Nobody handed you that number. You found it. That's not nothing, Kimberly. That's the beginning of getting your voice back, not the end of losing it. She hugged me there in the parking lot, careful of my chest the way she'd been careful with me since the surgery. I stood there holding my daughter for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. I thought about Opal. I thought that whatever else this whole ugly business had cost, it had given me this back. A daughter standing up straight again, asking her own hard questions, trusting her own read on the world. That felt in that parking lot like the real payoff. Everything else, the trust, the easement, the licensing board, the lawsuit, all of it had simply been the fence that held the gate shut long enough for this one thing to happen on its own timeline. The months after the reading moved slower than the months before it had. I mean that as a compliment to how they moved. Slow after a stretch like that is exactly what a person needs. The licensing board concluded its inquiry 7 weeks after the reading. Chad's broker's license was suspended for 2 years, not revoked outright, though by the time the suspension took effect, his brokerage had already closed its doors, unable to make payroll for its 2 remaining employees once the last of its client relationships dried up under the weight of the lawsuit and the public record surrounding it. The $44,000 frozen in his escrow account was released to satisfy part of the landlord's judgment, which had by then grown to $173,000, with accrued interest and legal fees. Corinne told me Chad's attorney negotiated a payment plan on the remainder. I never asked for details past that point. I'd stopped keeping score of his losses the way I'd kept score of my own gains for 44 years. Some ledgers you close and set aside, once the balance has settled itself without you needing to add anything further to either column. I heard, through channels I didn't go looking for, that Chad eventually took a job selling commercial insurance out of a strip mall office in a different part of San Antonio, a fair distance from the neighborhood where his old brokerage had once occupied that $161,000 suite he could never fill. I don't know if that's true in every detail, I know it's the kind of ending that fits a man who spent 11 years married into a family that built things with their hands. While he himself had only ever leased space, literally and otherwise, never quite owning the ground he stood on in any sense that mattered. Kimberly's divorce finalised that winter, 5 weeks after the reading, clean and uncontested in the end, since Chad's finances by then left him little appetite for a fight that would only put more of his conduct on public record. She kept full custody of Wren. She kept her maiden name back, Hargrove, a decision she told me she'd made on her own, without asking my opinion first, which I understood, once she explained it to me, as its own quiet piece of the ledger settling back the right direction. I want Wren to grow up understanding whose name actually built something, she told me, the week she filed the paperwork. Not the name on a business card, the name on a deed. I didn't argue with that. I've never in my life argued with a true sentence spoken plainly. She moved that spring into a house on the edge of my own property, a small place I'd kept for a ranch manager decades earlier and hadn't used in years, close enough that Wren could walk to the main house most afternoons after school, close enough that I could hear, some evenings, the two of them out at the corral together. Kimberly teaching her daughter the same things I'd once taught Kimberly: how to read a steer's ear flick, how to call a weight within 10 pounds just by watching the way an animal carries itself under load. I want to tell you about one particular evening that spring, because I think it's the truest measure of how far things had come. Kimberly asked me over supper if I'd teach her the auctioneer's call, the actual rhythm of it, the fast rolling patter I'd used for 30 years selling other people's cattle in that barn on the edge of town. She'd heard me do it 1,000 times as a girl, she said, but she'd never once tried it herself. Always too shy, always assuming it was a thing only her father could do. I walked her out to the empty corral that evening. Just the two of us. I taught her the basic pattern, the way the numbers roll into each other, the way you never fully stop talking even while you're listening for the next bid. She stumbled through it at first, laughing at her own mistakes. Then, somewhere in the third or fourth try, she found the rhythm of it. For a minute out there in the fading light, my daughter sounded exactly like her mother used to sound, reading a ledger out loud. Precise and unhurried, and entirely her own. "You've got it," I told her. "You've had it the whole time. You just needed a quiet corral and nobody talking over you to find it." She didn't say anything to that. She didn't need to. I watched her face and I understood she'd heard the fuller meaning underneath the compliment. The same way she'd understood, months earlier at that kitchen table, exactly what Corinne's careful sentences about the capacity evaluation had really meant. Wren turned 14 that summer. I watched her take to ranch work the way her mother had at that age. A natural feel for animals that either lives in a person or doesn't. No amount of teaching able to manufacture it where it isn't already sitting quiet, waiting to be noticed. Boyd started giving her small responsibilities that summer, checking water troughs on her own section of the property, keeping her own simple ledger of which pastures needed rotating and when. I watched her take that ledger as seriously as any accountant I'd ever hired, printing her numbers careful and square, the way her great-grandmother Opal had once kept the auction barn's books. I told her one evening that summer, sitting on the porch in the chair that used to be Opal's, that I was proud of how she'd carried herself through the whole ugly business with Chad. The sign, the reading, the whisper campaign at the diner counter that half the town had eventually heard some version of. "I didn't do anything," she said. "You and Mom and Corinne did everything. I just waited. Waiting well is doing something," I told her. "Your grandmother used to say patience is just competence that hasn't been asked to move yet. You waited well. That's a skill same as any other. You're going to need it plenty more times before your life's through, so I'm glad you've already got the hang of it at 14. She smiled at that. I thought, watching her, about the letter sitting in the safe deposit box in San Antonio. 4 more years from being opened. I thought about how strange and good it felt to know that whatever happened to me between now and then, Opal's voice was going to reach that girl at exactly the moment she needed to hear it. The same way it had reached me at exactly the moment I needed to hear it, sitting alone at a roll-top desk, 2 years into a fight I hadn't fully understood yet, when it started. Before I tell you about the last conversation I had with Chad, I want to tell you about a phone call I made to a stranger. I think it matters just as much to how this story ends. Maybe more. A few months after the licensing board concluded its inquiry, Corinne mentioned to me, almost in passing, that Perry Dunlop's small brokerage had taken a hit that year too. Not from anything he'd done wrong, just from the same soft patch in the commercial market that had helped sink Chad's 2 big clients in the first place. Perry had 2 young agents on his payroll, Corinne told me. Good workers by her account. He was one slow quarter away from having to let them go. I thought about that man for a while. The one who'd frozen a listing the moment his own title search flagged something wrong. Who'd called me himself months later just to make sure I heard the truth about the other two agencies from him directly, rather than second-hand. A man who could have looked the other way at any point in that whole business. Who chose, every single time, to do the careful, honest thing instead, at some cost to his own bottom line. I called him directly and told him I had some property matters coming up. Minor things. A small parcel adjustment on the ranch's eastern boundary. An old outbuilding I wanted appraised and possibly sold off separately from the main trust. Nothing that needed his help, strictly speaking. Corinne could have handled all of it without involving an outside broker at all. I hired him anyway, paid him a fair commission on work that barely needed doing. $11,000 across two small transactions that any competent lawyer could have processed directly. I wanted a man who'd done right by a stranger, at real risk to himself, to feel that doing right by people eventually finds its way back around. I didn't tell him that was the reason. I just told him I appreciated how he'd handled the mess with Chad, that I wanted to send him some business as thanks. He thanked me like a man who didn't fully understand why he was being thanked, which I took as further proof I'd read him right the first time. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Chad, because there was one. A full year after the sign went up. I think it belongs at the end of this story rather than in the middle of it, since it's the piece that finally let me set the whole business down for good. He called me directly, which surprised me, since by then all our business had run through lawyers for the better part of a year. I almost didn't pick up. I recognised the number, sat looking at the phone through 2 full rings. Then I answered it. Mostly out of the same curiosity that's kept me reading a herd my whole life, wanting to see how a thing finishes even when I already know the shape of the ending. "Russell," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." "I wasn't sure either," I told him honestly. There was a long pause. I could hear in the background the sound of a strip mall parking lot, cars passing, somebody's radio playing faintly through an open window somewhere. "I'm not calling to ask for anything," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I've had a lot of time to think this year, selling insurance to people who used to be my clients in a different life, and I wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not the way I said it at the reading. Actually sorry." I let him keep talking. A man finally telling the truth deserves the courtesy of finishing his sentence. Even a man who spent a good stretch of time lying to me and to my daughter both. I told myself the whole time I was doing it that I was solving a problem before it got worse, he said. The lease, the clients leaving, all of it. I told myself once I fixed the money, everything else would sort itself out. That Kimberly would understand eventually. That you'd understand eventually, once you saw I'd only been trying to protect the family from a mess I'd made. I don't think I ever let myself really look at what I was actually doing to you, specifically. To an old man in a hospital bed. I don't have a good excuse for that. I just have that. I sat with it a moment before I answered. "Chad," I said, "I appreciate you saying that. I mean that plainly, no trick in it. But I want to tell you something, and I want you to actually hear it. Not just wait for me to stop talking so you can respond." "Okay," he said. "You didn't make one mistake," I said. "You tried the same lie 3 separate times, at 3 separate agencies, after the first one caught you clean. A man who tries a thing once under panic, I can understand that. I might even forgive that, given time. A man who tries it 3 times, refining his story a little each time, hoping the next audience won't look as close as the last one did. That's not panic anymore. That's a method. Somewhere in you, you know the difference. Even now, even saying sorry into a phone in a parking lot, he didn't argue with that. I'll give him that much credit. A year earlier, at that dinner table, he'd have found some new angle to argue from. Whatever this year had done to him, it had at least worn down that particular reflex. "I know," he said quietly. "I know the difference. I'm not going to tell you I forgive you," I said. "I'm not there and I'm not sure I ever will be. I don't think you need me to be, for whatever you're trying to build for yourself now. But I'll tell you this, Kimberly's doing well. Ren's doing well. Whatever you're carrying about that, you can set it down. At least the part of it that's about worrying whether you broke them permanently. You didn't. They're standing just fine." "That's good to hear," he said. And I believed, hearing his voice, that he meant it. We didn't talk long after that. There wasn't much left to say that either one of us needed to say out loud. He asked, at the very end, almost as an afterthought, if I'd tell Kimberly he'd called, that he was sorry, in case it mattered to her one day, even if it didn't change anything now. I told him I would. I did, that same week over supper. She listened quietly. When I finished, she said, "I'm glad he said it. I don't need to hear it myself, but I'm glad he said it to somebody." I think that's about as clean an ending as that particular thread was ever going to get. I've made my peace with it landing exactly there. No cleaner, no messier. I want to tell you one more thing about that conversation because I've turned it over more than most of what happened that year. Chad asked me, right before we hung up, whether I thought a man could really change after doing something like that. I told him I didn't know. I told him I'd spent 44 years reading cattle, not men, and cattle don't lie to themselves the way people do. A steer that's about to bolt doesn't tell itself a story about why bolting's really an act of love for the herd. A man can talk himself into almost anything, given enough motive and enough time alone with his own excuses. Whether Chad had actually stopped doing that, I couldn't say from one phone call. I told him the only proof that would ever mean anything was years of it. Lived quiet, with nobody watching and nothing to gain from looking better than he was. He said he understood. I believed he wanted to understand, which isn't the same thing, but it's not nothing either. I'm 74 years old now, 2 years past that surgery. I still run this ranch, though I let Boyd handle more of the daily work than I used to. I let Ren, now 16, handle more than either of us expected a 16-year-old to handle this early. The girl has a gift for it that reminds me every single day of watching her mother at that age. Further back than that, of watching Opal keep a set of books so clean you could have framed any page of them. The land trust still holds all 1,100 acres, exactly as Corinne and I built it 11 years ago now, exactly as it will keep holding it until Ren turns 18 in a little under 2 years, at which point she'll inherit not just the acreage, but the responsibility of it. The fences, the herds, the whole slow accumulation of 44 years of a life's work, plus whatever she chooses to build on top of it with her own 2 hands. The way I built on top of 80 leased acres, the way my father never got the chance to. The conservation easement still sits on the 5 acres under the house. Permanent, untouchable. Exactly as it was the morning a nurse woke me up asking about a sign I hadn't authorised. That sign, by the way, came down the same week as the family dinner, the very Sunday the trust and the letter came out on that kitchen table. I didn't ask Boyd to pull it. I did it myself. Slow and careful. My chest still tender from the surgery. Walked out into the yard that same evening, after everybody had gone. Worked the post loose from the ground with my own 2 hands. Laid it flat in the bed of my truck. I kept it, actually. It's out in the workshop now, leaned against the back wall behind an old grain bin. The glossy panel faded some by the years since. My ranch's front gate still visible on it, if you look close. The price and the phone number that was never mine still printed clear across the bottom. Ren asked me once, walking through the workshop with me, why I'd kept it instead of throwing it away, like any reasonable man would have. I told her the truth. I keep it the same reason a mechanic keeps a busted part on a shelf after he's fixed the machine. Not out of anger, not out of sentiment exactly, but as a reminder of exactly what kind of failure looks like up close, so you recognise the early signs of it faster the next time trouble starts building somewhere you can't yet see it. "Do you think there'll be a next time?" she asked. "Probably not this exact shape of trouble," I told her. But some shape of it, somewhere down the line, for you, or for somebody you love. That's just how it goes, living long enough and building something worth having. People will always come looking for ground they didn't earn, one way or another. The trick isn't avoiding that. The trick is making sure the ground's already fenced properly, years before anybody comes looking. She nodded at that the way she nods at most things I tell her. Serious, careful, filing it away for later, the way her grandmother used to file away a column of numbers she wasn't ready to add up yet. I think about Opal often these days, more than I expected to at this stage of my life. 6 years gone now, going on 7. I think about that kitchen table, the same one Chad sat at explaining that everything was under control, the same one Corinne laid a folder on the night the whole business finally came apart. I think about a woman who spent 30 years keeping a set of books so honest you could build a case in a courtroom off any single page of them, who spent the last clear week of her life making sure her husband understood exactly what mattered most, in case she wasn't there to say it again later. She wasn't there to say it again later. But I heard her anyway, in a letter 12 years buried in a roll-top desk, at exactly the moment I needed to hear it. I think that's the truest kind of love a person can leave behind. Not a fortune, though there was a fortune too, real and earned and worth defending. But a sentence simple enough to survive a decade in a drawer and still land exactly right the day somebody finally reads it. Don't let the land go to whoever's loudest at the table. Let it go to whoever's still standing on it when the dust settles. I never threw a punch in this whole business, not one, not even close. I never raised my voice past the volume of an ordinary conversation. The only weapons I ever used were the ones I'd been sharpening my whole life without fully realizing it. Cold patience. A habit of reading trouble before it moves. A plain, unhurried willingness to lay the truth flat on a table and let it do its own work. The way a good fence does its own work, standing quiet in a pasture, needing no defence at all, beyond simply having been built right the first time. Chad tried to take a ranch out from under a man he thought was too sick and too old to notice. He never checked whose name was actually on the ground he was standing on. That's the whole story, if you want it in one sentence. I'm still standing on it. I expect to be, for whatever years I've got left. Long after that, I expect Wren will be standing on it too, learning to read the herd the same way her mother did, the same way I did, the same way somebody in this family will keep doing, I hope, for a long time after my own name's just another line in a ledger somebody else keeps. Sometimes, in the evenings now, I still sit out on that porch in Opal's old chair. I look at the spot in the grass where that sign used to stand, 30 feet off the porch, angled for maximum visibility. I don't feel anger anymore when I look at it. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds. That sign forced a reckoning that might otherwise have taken years to surface on its own. Might have waited until I really was too old and too slow to answer it the way I answered it that year. Chad's greed, in its own backward way, tested every fence I'd ever built, all at once, while I still had the strength left to watch it hold. A fence you never test is a fence you never really know the value of. I know the value of mine now. I know it down to the dollar, down to the clause, down to the exact weight it can bear before it gives, because somebody finally leaned on it hard enough to prove it out. 44 years of building, and it took one bad year to show me exactly what all that building had actually been worth. All along, to the people who mattered. The dust settled. I was still standing. That was always going to be enough, and I never once needed to raise my voice to make it true. Boyd still comes by most mornings, older now himself, walking a little slower than he used to, though he'd never admit it. We sit on the porch some days and don't say much of anything, the way two men can sit together after 30 years of trusting each other completely. And I think that silence is its own kind of wealth too. One Chad never once understood was even on the table.